Welcome to Why Medics Matter, a podcast for doctors by doctors in association with DoctorsTraining. Each episode will be hosted by myself, Dr Anna Burbridge, and
Dr Simon Frazer.
In this episode, we are joined by the wonderful Dr Anna Baverstock. I met Anna last year and was immediately charmed by her warmth, openness, and I felt like I'd known her for years. Anna is a paediatrician, a wellbeing lead, coach mediator, and she loves to doodle. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us today.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. What a lovely welcome. Thank you.
So today, I thought we could have a conversation about reflecting on challenging, difficult conversations that we have with colleagues at work. Now, one of the things we're trained really well at as doctors is to have conversations with patients. They can be difficult, challenging, but we're not actually trained to have those type of conversations with colleagues, fellow trainees, educators. And that is often something that I can become pretty unstuck with at work. Simon, is this something that echoes with you?
Absolutely. I think we're good with patients, but we often avoid conversations with colleagues. We're fearful of upsetting people, ending silence, or what I would say violence, really. Amie, you were telling me the other day about a difficult conversation. I wonder if you're happy to share your challenge.
Yes. So what I'm going to do, Anna, is I thought if I share to you some conversations I've had or some difficulties I've had, and then I guess get your perspective on it, if that's okay. So I guess you could say I like to avoid confrontation. It makes me feel really uncomfortable. I get incredibly anxious about it. And one particular conversation springs to mind. It was actually quite a few years ago now, but I think it was probably the most challenging conversation I've had to have at work. And I was a consultant at the time. And the person I had to have the conversation with was a locum registrar, so being qualified for around 10 years. And the lead for the department was actually off. So I was the most senior person, or felt to be the most senior person in the department. And I've been approached by 2 or 3 different people over the course of a week to say that they felt that this individual was bullying them. They felt that they were being undermined at work. They felt that when they were working with this individual, he was quite dismissive of them, treated them as though they were not peers. And as soon as that word bullying is mentioned, it gets me quite angry, actually, because I'm thinking, I can't let this happen at work. But obviously, you jump to conclusions and you have to clarify that that's actually what's happening. And because 2 or 3 people had mentioned it and I got emails to clarify this, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to address this. What on earth do I do? So I spoke to the manager on the ward, so not a clinician, but somebody who has some human resources experience, and said to myself, if I'm going to have this conversation, I'm going to need some support in there. And I went in, guns blazing, having this conversation with HR. It just went wrong. And it went wrong for many reasons. I was unprepared. I think I was so angry on behalf of the trainees that I didn't clarify the information, that I just went right for it. And at the end of the conversation, the individual said, I can't believe you've just done that. What you're doing to me is what you've accused me of. And I was like, I have done that so badly. And I came out feeling awful. He felt awful. We all felt awful. It was a disaster. So any conversation I have to have now, I can't do it. And even talking about it now, I'm like, feeling anxious. Does this resonate? Where did I go wrong? What can I do right next time?
Yeah, so goodness me, it absolutely resonates. So I have had lots and lots of challenging conversations. I call them sweaty palm conversations. And I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is they don't ever get any more comfortable. They are always slightly uncomfortable because you only ever have one half of the script. And no matter how carefully you curate it, you can only work out and hold your side of it. But But with practice and with perhaps a slight reframe around intention, what I would suggest is you get more comfortable being uncomfortable. Okay, so I think there are some absolute things from what you've said that I hope will help you and wider listeners. So the first thing you said, and you reflected beautifully, is what energy are you bringing into the room with the conversation? So I ask myself a question, look in the mirror, and I say, am I ready to have this conversation? And what I mean by that is, am I ready to have this conversation in service of the person that I'm having the conversation with? Because I'm going to look at the information and the feedback together. We're going to come up with a plan together, and I'm going to do that with kindness and compassion. And sometimes I'm not ready to have that conversation because I'm either in fight or flight because I'm stressed, or I'm actually just really angry and cross with them. So then I have to think, am I the right person to have this conversation? And what do I then need to do to get ready? So number one, am I ready? And number two, are they ready before you start? So actually, I tend to ask them a question, and I frame it in a way that it's pretty obvious that we need to have a conversation. I say something along the lines of, I need to have a conversation with you, and I'm just checking, is this a good time? And if they say yes, great. If they say, do you know what? No, then we put something in to schedule it. So that's the first really important thing. Okay. The other bit around the kind of holding, we're having this conversation in service of them. And Amie, I don't suspect this is going to resonate right now, but honestly, I promise you in time it does. How about if we reframe challenging conversations, difficult conversations, as a conversation that improves connection? Because I really believe that you can have a very challenging conversation with a colleague where you're giving really difficult feedback and talking about some really challenging things. And at the end of it, they thank you for it. And actually, you then feel more connected. And I guess a little motivator, if you've had some challenging or some brave feedback given to you by a colleague and time goes by, are you more likely to go back and ask them if you want an honest opinion about something? Who do you ask? Who are your critical friends? And I would suggest they're people that at some point have effectively given you the gift of feedback of something that you haven't particularly noticed before. So I guess those are my starting points. To be honest, they're the most important things, because whatever happens subsequently, if you're going in with that motivation, will be felt. So compassion, you connect with compassion and empathy, you listen, however you then phrase it, that's your intention. There's just another little tweak that we sometimes need to make before we then think about how we might frame the conversation. And I learned this from Brené Brown and on her work around emotions. And she talks about the near and far enemies of emotion. So it's a Buddhist concept. So if we're wanting to connect with empathy, then we're basically wanting to listen to the story that someone else tells about whatever's happened and believe them. Okay. So often we fall into the trap of what we call the near enemy, which is sympathy. So sympathy is anything that starts with at least. Because effectively what we're saying is, at least it's not you, at least it's not me. It's a disconnecting emotion. So empathy is a connecting emotion, sympathy is a disconnecting emotion. And there's that beautiful short, isn't there, around empathy and sympathy that I'm sure many of us have seen from Brené Brown. The near enemy of compassion is pity. And again, that's disconnecting. And again, if we're having these really tricky conversations with someone where we're cross with them, we're holding a mirror up to their behaviour, we want them to own their behaviour, but also actually we slightly want to punish them, then effectively what we're doing is we're disconnecting. So what I'm suggesting is, can we reframe that conversation in a connecting way? Okay. It's not easy, because sometimes we need to sit and listen to quite a lot of emotion and challenge, because let's face it, most of us in response to, can I give you some feedback, would be like, not today, thank you. I'm all about the growth mindset, but just right now, I don't want to do that. So I don't know if that clarifies it in terms of the intention going on, and then we can maybe we can pick apart the how you might then phrase that conversation.
So just to pick up on a few things that you said then, one of the things I think that often drives me in medicine, in life in general, is my emotions. I'm an incredibly emotional person. I wear my heart on my sleeve. You know, everybody knows when I'm happy, when I'm sad, I cry at work. I find it really hard to take that part away from me, to sort of take my personality away from that conversation. Mm-hmm. And in that particular moment, I was so angry with what I'd been told. How do I get rid of that anger? How do I go, actually, I'm going to park you there, I'm going to forget about you, and I'm going to go into this conversation with compassion? Yeah, that's a real struggle.
So you can't suddenly switch off emotions. So we're emotional beings that are occasionally able to think and apply logic, rather than logical thinking robots that are occasionally able to be emotional. Okay, so you're not going to be able to switch off your emotion. And actually, if you switched off your emotion, people would be a little bit worried about you, Amie, knowing you as I do, in terms of, oh my goodness me, what's happened. So can you reframe that? So can you actually think, do you know what, I'm angry because what I want, I don't want this behaviour to happen in my department, and actually I'm really upset about that. And can you share some of that emotion, but perhaps in a slightly different way, which might be, I'm feeling quite emotional about this because I really want to help you to be able to see how your behaviour has affected other people. And I apologise if some of that tips into how I come across. And own it. And if you feel that's happening, then to take a step away. What I would suggest, though, is it's one of those conversations where you really need to make sure that all of your gauges are absolutely on neutral when you go in. This is not a conversation to have when you've just had a really emotionally fraught thing. It's are you hungry, angry, late, lonely, tired? If you're any of those things, you need to address all of those things before you have the conversation. But I also think it shows a human side of us to think about what it is that we're angry. We're not really angry at the person for them. We're not wanting to shame and blame them for what they've done. We're angry that the behaviour that they have come out with has had an impact on your colleagues. And actually what you're wanting to do is to share with them about that behaviour and to give them the benefit of being able to see and reflect on it, because they may not be aware of any of that.
And I wonder if I could just give a bit of a lens on that as well, is sometimes we see behaviours which upset us and make us angry, but actually we don't understand why those behaviours are happening. So actually what's going on? I think one of your favourite questions, Anna, is, are you okay? As you go into it, and actually the emotion's okay, and we need to regulate. Because when I worked as a director of medical education, when people go in these conversations with anger and frustration, it doesn't matter how well they think they control the words, their emotions leak in the body language and the tone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, so you could, and the other thing I think that's really important about these conversations is less. So listen, I love the listen your way out of conflict rather than talk your way into conflict. So actually sometimes it's about a few words and then listen. So what I might do in this situation, particularly if I'm thinking, do you know what, it's not going to take much for these emotions to surface because I'm really cross, is to use a sort of the cup of coffee approach. And the cup of coffee approach is, I need to have a conversation with you about something that's happened in ED. But before I do, I just want to check how things are because I noticed that it's been quite busy and you've not been quite yourself. Pause. Less is more. And then you might want to say something along the lines of, it's been reported to me that a couple of times you've said things to colleagues that have left them feeling really upset. And I would be really specific. So, would name some names where you can. And so you want to describe the behaviour as much as clearly as possible. And then the magic bit is, and I know that you'd want to know. So effectively, you're passing them the opportunity to be able to potentially go and do an immediate corrective thing, which is, my goodness me, I had no idea. And honestly, if you leave it fairly straightforward like that, then 95% of the time, someone will go, oh my goodness me, do you know what? I was really short. I was really tired. I hadn't realised I'd had that impact. I will go and apologise. Okay. And that's from Jerry Hickson's work in Vanderbilt University in the States. Now, sometimes there's a pattern of behaviour. So it may be, for argument's sake, Amie, that someone had a cup of coffee conversation once or maybe twice with this individual, and then there's a pattern of behaviour. So then you need to have the sort of the next stage of conversation. And I don't think it's a bad idea to take someone in with you. So if there's a a single event that is clearly racist or homophobic or is, really, really challenging, or there is a pattern of behaviour which, despite your initial conversations, doesn't seem to be changing, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And certainly the Vanderbilt University, you go up the triangle, don't you? You go up, you step it up. And I think what you then need to do, but you still potentially only have your version. So I guess it's, we talk about Johari's window, don't you? Feedback is the blind quadrant. But if you imagine a Venn diagram with two circles, we have our version, my version, and the person who had the challenging behaviour has their version. And the overlap at the beginning of the conversation is largely based on your relationship and the amount of benefit of doubt you're going to be able to give each other in the conversation. So if we're having a conversation as close colleagues, then actually there's quite a bit of overlap and trust there, isn't it? But we're still only seeing our version, or if it has been reported to us, we're still only describing that version through our own lenses. So you then put our knowledge, our assumption, our biases, our feelings, our values, our privilege, our interpretation, our mood, all of those things go into our opinion. Okay, so our starting point might be, so it's the advocacy with inquiry approach is, this is what I saw, this is what I think, I'm curious as to what you think. And again, less is more. You don't need to give a whole 3-minute spiel on all of the behaviour. It could be, I saw, I think I'm curious, and see what they then come back with. And I don't know if you can rewind your conversation, because let's face it, retrospect is we always imagine the things that we could have done better. If you'd gone in with a bit less to start with, might you have got a slightly different approach? I don't know. You might have got something different.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you did beautifully there was actually give me some stock phrases that I could probably use, like, are you okay? This is what I saw. I'm curious. Instead of saying, I've had these many emails, so-and-so's told me, and they're just railroading the conversation instead of actually letting the individual explain to me. And really, I should have given them more airtime. Any conversation like this shouldn't just be me rabbiting on. And actually, on reflection, I dominated that conversation, which was completely wrong. I was very early on in my consulting career, and I think, I still have a lot to learn, but there's probably a bit of arrogance in it as well, finding my feet.
I wonder as well, is it actually just reflects your natural thinking style? So I'm imagining you're similar to me, and that as an extrovert, I think aloud, and when under pressure, I talk my way as I'm thinking. And in a conflict situation, that can be incredibly challenging. It's also incredibly challenging if the person that you're giving feedback to needs the pauses, needs the silence, and needs the time for reflection. So again, saying, this is what I saw, this is what I think, I'm curious, and then holding a silence that goes beyond anything that we're potentially comfortable with. Because for them, it's not silent at all. They're mulling over all of these, their feedback triggers us. We get truth triggered, relational trigger, identity trigger, all of these thoughts and feelings and emotions are bubbling up in them. And actually, that's a really important thinking time. And you might even just start with, I can see that there's a lot that's resonant, that there's a lot going on for you, or you seem to be thinking about a lot. Would it be helpful to start sharing some of that?
Simon, can I ask you about silence? And is it something that you're comfortable with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think silence is really important because often when you ask somebody a question, they'll give you the first answer, the prepared answer. So if you're really good and you listen and you don't interrupt, because most of the times we want to interrupt, we've got ideas and our thoughts, the conversation's coming, and we let it roll. And then we stop and think, oh, good, I've been really good, I can now talk, but you don't. You just ask what I call a deepening question. Okay, just tell me a bit more, develop that, and you get the second wave. And then you can reflect back. And Because what you're trying to do, and as you talk about advocacy with inquiries, you're trying to be non-judgmental. And I think things will trigger emotions, but you've got to remember, you don't know the facts. You've got one side, and you don't know there might be a really deeper reason. You know, we see a lot of challenging behaviors in, I think, good people that maybe aren't in a good place. And I think that the kind of question is, what's going on for you? Because I wouldn't normally expect you to behave that way. Anna, I wonder if I could ask you another question, because we've talked nicely about how you approach on the behalf of others, which is challenging, but maybe a bit easier. Can you give me some tips where you feel you've got to address something that's happened between you and another colleague, and how phrases that you can use for that?
Yeah. So I actually find that easier because it becomes more my direct version. But I can appreciate that for some, having third parties. So again, I think very honestly, am I the right person to have this conversation? Am I the right person? You know, I think hierarchy does come into it. I think is there a better person? I have I guess a mind's eye picture of my Venn diagram. How well do I know this person? How much kind of trust is there? How much psychological safety is there? And then I usually end up with, well, I think I probably would rather have the conversation and mess it up than have someone else have the conversation and mess it up. And I'm deliberately, you know, I don't mind a messy middle as long as it fosters good connection at the end. So I would probably do similar sort of things. And actually, I really like there's a good judgment paper, I can't remember the title of it, by Rudolph et al. And it talks about, so rather than non-judgmental or judgmental, we use good judgment. And so this is where we are allowed to state our opinion and what we think, but equally we provide a big space for what they might say and what they think. So I can give you a couple of examples. I've had colleagues eye roll at me on a Teams call. They didn't realise that they were doing it. And I pinged them a message straight after the Teams call and said, I'd really like to have a conversation about something that just happened in that Teams call, because I don't know if you were aware of it. And they Teams called me, which I wasn't expecting. So I was like, okay, there's literally no preparation. And so I just said really clearly, I said, I don't know if you realise, I said, when I was speaking about presenting something in the meeting, I saw you roll your eyes and it made me, and I was just surprised, but I said, I'm determined, I'm going to reframe that. I'm just quite curious as to what was going on for you. And he was great. He said, do you know what? He said, didn't thank you. He said, I had no idea that that's what I'd done. It's now making me think how many other times I've done that. And I said, well, actually, you know, it's actually really helpful for me because it was really helpful feedback that something that I was saying wasn't really resonating. And we then had a conversation about that as well. Now, the beauty of that is that it was immediate. Now, that was happenstance. I pinged him an email straight away because I thought if I don't do it now, I'll forget. It'll become something that I will be too scared to do. And I wasn't expecting him to call straight away. The interesting thing about that is that he phoned me. So that slightly changed the power dynamic and it made it so much easier. So he was coming in with a curiosity around what was I going to say. So that's quite a recent thing. A harder conversation, I think, to Amy's point, is the ones where there's a few things that rumble on and then you get to the tipping point of I'm going to have the conversation. And then I sort of beat myself up because I think I wish I'd said it earlier, but I wasn't totally sure. And I'd done a bit of benefit of the doubt, or I wasn't sure. And I know that in that situation, presenting a kind of long list of challenging things that you've done this, and this isn't terribly helpful. So what I usually do is start with the most recent, the thing that's caused the tipping point. The trigger. And I'd normally, again, use, I can't think immediately of an example, but I normally do I want to have a conversation with you about this. Because I really want to make sure that we have some clarity moving forward. So, for example, it might be a colleague hasn't delivered a project on time, or they've been too busy and they've not really shared something, and then they've shared something and I've not been very happy with them and I need to have a conversation about it. And what I usually start with is I just want to go back and put some boundaries around what we're trying to do, because I'm worried I haven't been clear enough about what my expectation is around this project and what we need to kind of deliver by when. So I think that those would be my sort of top tips. If it's a long list of behaviour, pick the most recent one. If it's and have the conversation sooner rather than later. So if you're aware that what I tend to say, if you're aware that there's a kind of grating edge with a colleague, just name that rather than wait for something to then have the feedback on. I don't know if that helps at all.
It does. What I've heard people say before, that it's important to distinguish between you did and I feel. And it changes the angle, because if I said you did this, you upset me, as opposed to saying when that happened, I felt undermined, I felt undervalued, I felt appreciated. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So incivility is how it's heard rather than how it's intended. So how do we know how our behaviour lands? Someone gives us the gift of feedback. So that is always and I guess that's sometimes how I do around the framing. I don't know if you realise, but when you raise your voice in handover, I felt really scared and I wasn't able to listen. And I have actually said that to a family. I haven't ever needed to say that to a colleague, but I had a dad who was really, really upset and really shouting. And I said to him, I'm really sorry. I said, I really want to be able to listen carefully to what you're saying, but because you're speaking so loudly, I'm finding it really hard to do that. So again, sometimes describing, and again, feedback is your opinion. It's not the gospel truth. It's your opinion. So using the this is what I sense. So, instead of you're not being very clear, I'm really sorry, I'm struggling to follow exactly what it is that you're saying, or, your behaviour is being really intimidating, or you are a bully. When you speak really loudly and stand near to me and stand over me, I feel a bit scared. So phrasing that as I, again, can be a really, really helpful way. Yeah, you're right, Simon. That's a really good kind of added tip to add in.
Can I just reflect on, we've talked about the timing of the feedback. So if, for example, there's a behaviour that's been building up and I know that I need to have a conversation, how do I invite the person to have that conversation without them going, oh my God, she wants to have a conversation with me, spending like a week at home panicking and getting worse. It's almost better. And in the acute setting, if something happens, a behaviour, for example, in resus, patient safety issue, it's really easy for me to handle that because I'm in the situation. But about a year ago, I had a phone call off somebody at work to say, can we talk? We need to discuss something. And I was like, oh my God, it's my day off. What is this about? And we had the conversation a couple of days later, and it turned out it was complete miscommunication, crossed wires. But those few days before waiting for that conversation were horrible. Yeah. And even reflecting on that now, you can feel your stomach going, it churns up those sort of anxious feelings, and it eats into everything you do. It eats into being at home, it eats into being at work. How can I prepare the individual in the most compassionate, kind way for that conversation?
Yeah. So you don't send the email at 5 to 5 on a Friday evening and then put your out of office in going, job done. Yeah, no, absolutely. So 2 things. You don't have to have the whole conversation wrapped up in one go. And again, when you're having a challenging conversation, when I begin to feel that I'm not listening anymore and I'm a bit overloaded, I can only imagine what it would be like for the other person on the receiving end. So I sometimes say, do you know what? We've covered an enormous amount. Would it be helpful to meet again to give us both a chance to reflect? That's the first thing. The second thing is I prefer, and again, it maybe is quite an individual thing. I prefer a bit of a heads up. I hate can we just have a conversation? Because I'm immediately we have a negative bias. We naturally have a negative bias because it's what's kept us safe for thousands of years. Okay. And we also, we absolutely need social connection. So one of these reasons that these conversations are so hard is because we're fearing isolation. And as you know, biologically, if we disconnect from the social group, we die. So it's part of our survival is connection. So I tend to try and have an introduction, conversation or an email where I put some time, some thought into how I say it. And I try and give a little bit of an overview as to what it is that I want to have a conversation about. So I don't give them the whole detail, but I might say, I'd like to have, so in the email to the guy about the with the rolling eyes, I'd said, I'd really like to give you some feedback about something that I noticed during that meeting that I'm not sure that if you were aware of. So something that kind of piques curiosity. Now, if he'd not Teams called me straight away and it had gone a little while, I might then reply saying, look, I'm just aware that I'm leaving today and I don't want to leave any doubt. In the Teams meeting today, you rolled your eyes when I was speaking and I'm not sure if you're aware of it. It's something that I'd be really curious to have a conversation about, just to see if that, I'm quite curious to explore a little bit what it was that you've found challenging about what I had to say, because that's really good feedback for me. But also I'm quite curious as to how aware you were. So and from speaking to colleagues, some people quite like a little bit of a heads up when they're coming in to the conversation. But I think you'd probably have to judge that based on what the feedback is, who you're having that conversation with. Because if it's completely out of the blue, so for example, a complaint about someone where it's seemingly really out of the blue, then you probably have to be quite careful about it. But the bottom line is, as soon as you put something in someone's diary, they're beginning to think about it anyway. So I think we cause more fear and worry by trying to protect someone by not sharing too much in advance, would be my natural tendency. The other thing to do is to, if you have had the conversation, particularly if you're working with a doctor in training over a period of time, have the kind of prelim conversation in terms of, look, we will naturally give each other feedback during the next year or 2 years. How are we going to communicate around it? And that sometimes helps.
Okay. That makes absolute sense, actually, because when I've had emails come to me or WhatsApp messages to say, can we chat? But there's no context. So you automatically think the worst. So actually, that's really nicely put, that if I put a little bit of context into that initial email, that conversation, it's a bit of a warning shot almost, isn't it? That you know what's going to come.
You're effectively using the advocacy, this is what I saw, this is what I think, I'm curious. So you're kind of doing a bit of advocacy inquiry in the email, I guess.
I've coached quite a lot of consultants who've got themselves in difficulty for one reason or other, and they often report getting an email from the medical director saying, can we meet you next week? Which is just a hard thing, isn't it? Just how did that person go away that weekend? So timing's really important.
Yeah.
I think going back to your research situation earlier on, it's important to avoid hot debriefs. So it's almost saying, right, can we catch up in a few hours? Just to give some feedback, I'm conscious we're coming towards the end, and I don't know if you wanted to ask a few more final summary questions, Amie.
Just one thing, actually. If I'm having this conversation and the person I'm having the conversation with gets quite defensive, what do I do?
So you name it. You say, so I'm really struggling. So you name your struggle. I'm really struggling with this conversation because I'm really concerned that the impact that your behaviour is having on the patient, the care, and on your team, and I'm concerned that you don't seem to be concerned by that. And I'm just wondering, is it that I haven't explained it very well, or is there something else going on? And I appreciate we're all busy. I know the shift. I know that we're overstretched, and I know that things are challenging, and we also have a responsibility around our own behaviour. So I know it's busy, and I know that sometimes there's lots and lots of things that go against our behaviour that make it harder for us to behave in a way that we want to, and we actually have a responsibility for around our behaviour. So I name it, and I sometimes say, I know when I've had a few conversations with a colleague from HR, and she says she knows when I bring out the phrase, I'm really concerned that I'm more concerned about this than you are, is what I normally say. And that makes me worry that I've perhaps not explained it very well. And so at that point, she starts chuckling because she just thinks, and then it's, so I just name it. Because what you can't do is pushed through. Now, sometimes that's a colleague that is just I've been trained to be a professional. We leave emotions and human side at home. So I'm going to listen to this conversation. I'm personally absolutely devastated, but I'm just putting up a really defensive shell here because I don't want to break down and cry in front of you or shout. So that's sometimes what I do. I don't mind that as much as someone who seemingly doesn't show any emotion at all and goes, yeah, okay. So you've just shared something really devastating and someone sort of nods. And then I sometimes say, I'm quite interested as to what you're thinking about that.
Anna, I wonder if I could just help me really with, you've given us so much information tonight and wisdom and connections. If you were to summarise this for anybody listening and they've got a difficult conversation in the next few days, could you give me 4 or 5 steps as takeaway?
Yeah. So the most important one is, am I ready to have this conversation? And am I ready to have this conversation in service of the person that I'm having the conversation with? Because my aim is to improve our connection. So can we reframe a brave, challenging, scary conversation into a connecting conversation? And alongside that, am I in a space to be able to listen generously? So listen with the benefit of the doubt to their answers. And then it's, I guess, however you want to frame the advocacy with inquiry. I think, I'm curious, as you're expanding up that Venn diagram of because all you've got is your version. And at the end of it, if you've got a really big overlap with your Venn diagram and you've changed your opinion about a couple of things and you've perhaps warmed to the individual even more, then you know that you've had a connecting conversation. So if I've had a conversation and I don't have any new information at the end of it, I haven't had a good conversation because I haven't managed to explore their version. So the best conversations are the ones where you have the light bulb moments of, do you know what, I can completely see how this happened and how this behaviour happened. We can now explore that together. And then if in doubt at any point during the challenge of the conversation, listen your way out of conflict rather than talk your way into conflict. So holding those listening silences, I think, are probably my kind of final thing. And I find that really hard, I'll admit that now.
So we've got a little question for you. If you, with all of your wisdom and your experience, if you could go back and chat to yourself as a bright new start doctor, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh gosh, great question on the spot. I think listen. And I think listen, so listen generously, listen to understand, listen to believe. I think I'm clearly an extrovert. I talk a lot. I listen for a breath such that I can reply. I listen to interrupt. I listen to throw in my 5 million brilliant ideas. What I'm not very good at is how you describe beautifully, listen again. So I think listen to try and keep the conversation in the patient's world, in your colleague's world, because every time you speak, you're transferring the conversation with a question. You're transferring the narrative back to your world. So I think that's what I would love to have said to my younger self. It would have got me out of a few really challenging scenarios that I can think of.
Me too.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that wonderful sort of whistle-stop tour of difficult conversations, challenging conversations, and definitely so many things in there that I'm going to take forward. Hopefully I won't be having too many challenging conversations, cross fingers, but just the way that you summarised it is incredibly helpful, and I hope that everybody else finds it as helpful as we did. Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you to everybody for listening. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.